The sun dipped below the skyline, casting a golden glow over the glass facade of Grant Enterprises. Inside the high-rise, the office buzzed with the familiar rhythm of keyboards clattering and phones ringing. Employees shuffled between cubicles, some packing up for the day, others settling in for another late night. But one man was always the first to leave. Daniel Carter moved like a shadow, his movements quick and deliberate. He avoided eye contact, slipping past colleagues with a quiet urgency. Every evening, at exactly 6 p.m., he disappeared. No goodbyes, no explanations. Michael Grant watched him from across the room. Disguised as an entry-level worker, Michael had spent weeks observing his employees. He had built Grant Enterprises from nothing, turning it into a multi-million-dollar empire. But lately, something felt off. The company was thriving, yet the people behind it seemed disconnected. And then there was Daniel. The man was a mystery. Hard-working, efficient, but always the first to leave. While others stayed late, chasing promotions and recognition, Daniel vanished without a trace. Tonight, Michael decided to follow him. As Daniel slipped out the door, Michael grabbed his jacket and trailed behind. The city streets were alive with the hum of evening traffic, but Daniel moved with purpose, weaving through the crowd like a man on a mission. Where was he going? And why the secrecy? Michael's curiosity burned brighter with every step. But what he was about to discover would shake him to his core and change everything he thought he knew about his company, his employees, and himself. The office hummed with the sound of keyboards clattering and phones ringing. Michael Grant sat at his desk, his eyes scanning the room. Dressed in a plain button-down shirt and slacks, he blended seamlessly with the other employees. No one suspected that the man typing away at his computer was the CEO of Grant Enterprises. For weeks, Michael had been working undercover, observing his employees. He wanted to see the company through their eyes, to understand the culture he had built. But one employee stood out, Daniel Carter. Daniel was a janitor, quiet and unassuming. He moved through the office like a ghost, cleaning up after everyone without a word. But what caught Michael's attention was his routine. Every day, at exactly 5:58 p.m., Daniel would grab his worn backpack and leave. No overtime, no small talk, just gone. Michael watched as Daniel clocked out, his movements quick and efficient. The man didn't linger, didn't say goodbye. He simply walked out the door, disappearing into the bustling city streets. "He's always the first to leave," a voice said nearby. Michael turned slightly, catching a group of employees gathered by the water cooler. They were whispering, their eyes darting toward the door Daniel had just exited. "Probably has a second job," one of them said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Or maybe he's just lazy. I heard he's got a criminal record," another chimed in. "Wouldn't surprise me." Michael's jaw tightened. He had heard enough. "Maybe he's got a family to take care of," he interjected, his tone calm but firm. The group fell silent, their eyes narrowing as they sized him up. Michael was new, just another face in the crowd. They didn't know who he was, and that was the point. "Family?" one of them scoffed. "Doubt it. He's probably just a deadbeat." The others laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. Michael clenched his fists under the desk, his frustration simmering. He had built this company to be a place of opportunity, a place where hard work was rewarded. But now, standing on the other side of the hierarchy, he saw the cracks in the foundation. The clock struck 6. Daniel was already gone, but Michael's curiosity burned brighter than ever. There was something about the man, something that didn't add up, and Michael was determined to find out what it was. The city streets were alive with the hum of evening traffic, the air thick with the scent of exhaust and fried food from nearby food trucks. Michael pulled his jacket tighter around him, his eyes locked on Daniel's retreating figure. The janitor moved with purpose, his strides quick and deliberate, as if he were navigating a path he'd walked 1,000 times before. Michael kept his distance, blending into the crowd of commuters. He felt a pang of guilt for following Daniel like this, but his curiosity had gotten the better of him. There was something about the man's quiet determination that didn't sit right with him. Daniel turned down a narrow alley away from the bright lights of the main road. Michael hesitated, glancing around. The alley was dimly lit, the walls lined with graffiti and the occasional flickering street lamp. He took a deep breath and followed. The further they went, the more the city seemed to fade away. The buildings grew older, their facades cracked and weathered. The streets were quieter here, the sounds of traffic replaced by the occasional bark of a dog or the distant wail of a siren. Michael's heart pounded as he watched Daniel disappear into an old, crumbling building. The sign above the door was barely legible. The letters faded with time. Hope Community Center. He paused, his mind racing. What was Daniel doing here? This wasn't the kind of place he'd expected. There were no bars, no shady characters lurking in the shadows. Instead, the building seemed to hum with life. Curiosity tugged at him, pulling him closer. He stepped inside, the door creaking softly as it swung open. The air was warm, filled with the scent of freshly cooked food and the sound of children's laughter. Michael's breath caught in his throat. The room was alive with activity. A group of kids sat at a long table, their heads bent over textbooks as they scribbled in notebooks. Others played in a corner, their laughter ringing out like music. Volunteers moved about, serving food and offering encouragement. And there, in the middle of it all, was Daniel. He was no longer the quiet janitor from the office. Here, he was someone else entirely. He knelt beside a young boy, helping him with a math problem, his voice gentle and patient. A little girl ran up to him, tugging at his sleeve, and he smiled, a genuine warm smile that lit up his entire face. Michael stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a side hustle or a criminal enterprise. This was something far more profound. Before he could step back, a woman approached him. She was tall and stern-looking, her arms crossed over her chest. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone sharp. Michael stammered, his mind racing for an explanation. I work with Daniel," he said finally. "I just wanted to see where he went every night." The woman's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, Daniel looked up. His eyes met Michael's, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The room fell silent as Daniel's eyes locked onto Michael's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The laughter of the children faded into the background, replaced by the heavy weight of unspoken questions. Michael stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quickly, his voice steady but laced with guilt. I wanted to understand." Daniel's expression shifted from surprise to suspicion. He stood slowly, his gaze never leaving Michael's. The children around him sensed the tension and instinctively moved closer to Daniel, as if seeking protection. The woman who had confronted Michael earlier stepped between them, her arms still crossed. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Michael hesitated. He could lie, keep up the charade, but something about the way Daniel looked at him made that impossible. "My name is Michael Grant," he said finally. "I'm Daniel's boss." The room erupted in murmurs. The woman's eyes widened, and Daniel's face hardened. "You followed me?" Daniel asked, his voice low but filled with disbelief. Michael nodded, his guilt growing with every passing second. "I didn't mean to intrude. I noticed you leaving early every night, and I wanted to know why." Daniel glanced at the children, then back at Michael. "And now you know," he said simply. Michael's eyes swept across the room, taking in the scene, the worn-out furniture, the peeling paint, the tired but determined faces of the volunteers. This wasn't just a community center. It was a sanctuary. "You run this place?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded. "It's not much, but it's home for these kids. They don't have anywhere else to go." Michael felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent years building a corporate empire, but this was something real, something meaningful. The woman stepped closer, her tone softening slightly. "Daniel's been doing this for years," she said. "He works all day at your company, then comes here to help these kids. He doesn't get paid for this. He does it because he cares." Michael's mind raced. He had been so focused on the company, on profits and productivity, that he had forgotten about the people behind it. And now, standing in this rundown building, he realized how much he had overlooked. "I had no idea," Michael said finally, his voice filled with regret. Daniel sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Most people don't," he said. "But now you do." Michael nodded, a newfound respect for Daniel growing in his chest. This wasn't just a man who left work early. This was a man who gave everything he had to make a difference. And Michael knew, in that moment, that he had a lot to learn. The night air was cool, the city's hum reduced to a distant murmur. Michael leaned against the wall of the community center, his breath visible in the dim light of a flickering street lamp. He had been waiting for over an hour, his mind racing with questions. Finally, the door creaked open, and Daniel stepped out, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He froze when he saw Michael, his expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "Why do you do this?" Michael asked, stepping forward. His voice was calm, but insistent. Why leave early every night? Daniel studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing. You're the new guy, he said finally, recognition dawning. The one who's been watching me. Michael nodded, not denying it. I just want to understand. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked tired, the weight of the world evident in his posture. You wouldn't get it, he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. Try me, Michael replied. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. Then, as if deciding he had nothing left to lose, he began to speak. I used to have a high-paying job, Daniel said, his voice low. I was on the fast track to success, Ivy League degree, corner office, the whole package. But then my brother died. A construction accident. The company he worked for cut corners to save money, and it cost him his life. Michael's breath hitched. He hadn't expected this. After that, I couldn't keep working for people who valued profits over lives, Daniel continued. So I left. I started this shelter because these kids, they don't have anyone else. I work at your company to fund it, but my real job is here. Michael stared at him, his mind reeling. He had built his empire on the idea of success, but standing here, listening to Daniel, he realized how hollow that idea could be. I'm sorry, Michael said finally, his voice heavy with regret. Daniel shrugged, his expression resigned. Sorry doesn't bring my brother back, but maybe it'll make you think twice about the people you step on to get to the top. With that, Daniel turned and walked away, leaving Michael standing alone in the cold night air. The penthouse was silent, the city lights casting a soft glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Michael sat at his desk, his laptop open, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Daniel, about the shelter, the kids, and the story Daniel had shared. He typed Daniel's name into the search bar, his fingers hesitating for a moment before hitting enter. The results flooded the screen. Academic achievements, awards, and a promising career trajectory. Daniel had been on top of the world, until he wasn't. Michael dug deeper, his heart sinking as he uncovered the details. A news article from years ago caught his eye. The headline read, "Family evicted after corporate land grab." He clicked on it, his stomach churning as he read. Daniel's family had lost their home to a shady real estate deal orchestrated by a powerful executive, the same executive who now worked at Grant Enterprises. Michael leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on building a company that valued hard work and integrity. But now, faced with the truth, he couldn't ignore the cracks in the foundation. He thought about Daniel, about the man who had given up everything to help others. Michael had spent years chasing success, but what had it cost him? What had it cost the people around him? The weight of his realization pressed down on him, suffocating. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. The lights twinkled like stars, but they offered no comfort. For the first time in years, Michael felt lost. He had built an empire, but at what cost? The faces of the children at the shelter flashed in his mind, their laughter echoing in his ears. He thought about Daniel's words. Maybe it'll make you think twice about the people you step on to get to the top. Michael clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. He returned to his desk and began typing, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He drafted new policies, outlined support programs, and made a list of names. Executives who had been with the company for too long, their corruption hidden behind a veneer of success. By the time the sun rose, Michael had a plan. It wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was about justice. The office buzzed with its usual energy, but Michael moved through it like a shadow. He was still undercover, still just another face in the crowd. But his purpose had shifted. He wasn't here to observe anymore. He was here to act. Over the next week, subtle changes began to ripple through the company. It started with small things. A new policy ensuring fair wages for janitorial staff, a fund to support employees facing financial hardship, and anonymous surveys to gauge workplace satisfaction. No one knew where the changes were coming from, but they felt them. Michael worked quietly, his influence unseen but undeniable. He spent hours reviewing contracts, digging into financial records, and meeting with department heads. He asked questions, pointed, uncomfortable questions, and listened carefully to the answers. One by one, the corrupt executives began to fall. It wasn't dramatic. There were no public firings or scandals. Instead, there were early retirements, sudden resignations, and quiet reassignments. The employees whispered about it, speculating about what was happening, but no one had answers. Michael watched it all unfold from his desk, his expression unreadable. He felt no satisfaction, only a grim determination. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. One evening, as the office emptied out, Michael stayed behind. He sat at his desk, staring at the list of names he had compiled. Each one represented a failure, a betrayal of the values he had thought his company stood for. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. "It's done," he said, when the person on the other end answered. "Make sure the press doesn't catch wind of it. We'll announce the changes next week." He hung up and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. There was still so much to do, so many people to help, so many wrongs to right. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. As he packed up his things and headed for the door, he passed Daniel's workstation. The janitor's backpack was gone, his chair neatly tucked in. Michael paused, a small smile tugging at his lips. Daniel had no idea what was coming. None of them did. But Michael did. And he wasn't going to stop until the company reflected the values it had lost along the way. The conference room was packed, employees filling every seat and lining the walls. Whispers filled the air as everyone speculated about the sudden all-hands meeting. No one knew what to expect, not even the executives. Daniel sat near the back, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had no interest in corporate announcements, but attendance was mandatory. He glanced at the clock, already counting the minutes until he could leave. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the room. A voice boomed over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your CEO, Michael Grant." The crowd erupted in murmurs as Michael stepped onto the stage. Gone was the plain button-down and slacks. He wore a tailored suit, his presence commanding and unmistakable. Daniel's eyes widened in shock. The new guy, the one who had been watching him, following him, was the CEO? Michael scanned the room, his gaze stopping on Daniel. For a moment, their eyes locked, and something unspoken passed between them. Then Michael turned to the crowd, his voice steady and strong. "For the past few weeks, I've been working among you," he began. "Not as your CEO, but as one of you. What I saw opened my eyes to the truth about this company. The good, the bad, and the ugly." He paused, letting his words sink in. "There are people in this room who have abused their power, who have put profits above people, and who have caused irreparable harm to families and communities." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Michael's gaze swept over the executives seated in the front row. "Effective immediately," he continued. "Those individuals are no longer part of this company." Gasps filled the room as security escorted several executives out. The crowd erupted in whispers, but Michael held up a hand, silencing them. "But this isn't just about cleaning house," he said. "It's about building something better. Starting today, Grant Enterprises will dedicate resources to supporting community initiatives, including the Hope Community Center, run by one of our own, Daniel Carter." The room exploded in applause, but Daniel sat frozen, his mind racing. The applause faded into a dull roar as Daniel sat frozen in his seat, his mind racing. He stared at Michael, his chest tightening with a mix of emotions: shock, disbelief, and something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Around him, employees whispered excitedly, some glancing his way with newfound respect. But Daniel barely noticed. His world had narrowed to the man on the stage, the man who had just turned his life upside down. As the meeting adjourned, Michael stepped off the stage and made his way through the crowd. Employees parted like the Red Sea, their eyes wide with curiosity. Daniel stood slowly, his legs unsteady, as Michael approached. "Daniel," Michael said, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." They moved to a quiet corner, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. Daniel crossed his arms, his guard up. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low. "Some kind of charity stunt?" Michael shook his head. "This isn't charity. This is making things right." Daniel stared at him, searching for any hint of insincerity, but all he saw was determination. "You didn't have to do this," Daniel said finally, his voice cracking. "Yes, I did," Michael replied. "You've been fighting alone for too long. Let us help." For a moment, Daniel said nothing. He thought about the shelter, about the kids who depended on him, about the years of struggle and sacrifice, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You're not alone anymore. Weeks later, the Hope Community Center was alive with energy. The peeling paint had been replaced with bright, cheerful colors. New furniture filled the rooms, and the shelves were stocked with books and supplies. The laughter of children echoed through the halls, louder and brighter than ever before. Daniel stood in the center of it all, a clipboard in hand, directing volunteers with ease. He wore a new title now, Director of Community Initiatives for Grant Enterprises. It was a role he had never imagined for himself, but one he embraced with quiet determination. Michael stepped through the front door, his presence immediately drawing attention. But today, he wasn't the CEO. He was just another volunteer. He carried a box of supplies, setting it down with a grin. "Looks like things are coming together," he said, glancing around. Daniel nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thanks to you." "Thanks to you," Michael corrected. "This was your vision. I just gave it a push." They stood side by side, watching as a group of kids played in the newly renovated courtyard. The sound of their laughter was like music, a testament to the power of second chances. "This isn't where I thought we'd end up," Daniel said after a moment, his voice thoughtful. Michael chuckled. "Me neither. But it's exactly where we were meant to be." Daniel glanced at him, his expression softening. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer defined him. "You've changed," Daniel said quietly. "So have you," Michael replied. "But maybe that's the point. We're not the same people we were a few months ago, and that's a good thing." They stood in silence for a while, watching as the kids played, their laughter filling the air. It was a new beginning, for the shelter, for the company, and for both of them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the courtyard, Daniel turned to Michael. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, "for believing in this, for believing in me." Michael smiled. "Thank you for showing me what real leadership looks like." And in that moment, surrounded by the sounds of hope and laughter, they both knew. This was just the beginning. The city skyline glittered in the distance, a tapestry of light stretching as far as the eye could see. Michael and Daniel stood on the rooftop of the shelter, the cool night air wrapping around them like a blanket. Below, the sounds of children laughing and playing echoed upward, a symphony of hope and renewal. Michael glanced at Daniel, a quiet smile on his face. "You know, I came to my company Undercover to evaluate my employees, but instead, I found a man who redefined what true leadership meant." Daniel chuckled softly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "And I thought I was just a janitor trying to make ends meet. Turns out, we both had a lot to learn." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey settling between them. Two men, once strangers from different worlds, now stood as brothers in arms. And in the process, they had changed each other's lives forever.